Sarah Martinez stepped out of the black sedan onto the dusty grounds of Forward Operating Base Phoenix, her civilian clothes drawing curious stares from the soldiers moving about their daily routines. The Afghan sun beat down mercilessly on the military compound, and she pulled her baseball cap lower over her eyes, grateful for the small protection it offered. To any observer, she appeared to be just another contractor or journalist visiting the remote outpost near the Pakistani border. The base buzzed with activity as soldiers prepared for the evening patrol briefings. Helicopters thundered overhead, their rotors kicking up clouds of fine dust that settled on everything like a persistent reminder of the harsh environment they all shared. Sarah had seen dozens of such bases during her years of service, but this visit was different. She wasn't here in any official capacity that these soldiers would recognize. As she made her way toward the command center, Sarah noticed the subtle signs of a well-run operation. The soldiers moved with purpose, equipment was properly maintained, and, despite the challenging conditions, morale seemed reasonably high. These observations came naturally to her after decades of military service, though none of the personnel bustling around her would guess at her extensive background. Colonel James Patterson emerged from the command tent, his uniform crisp despite the oppressive heat. At 45, he cut an imposing figure with his broad shoulders and stern expression. Patterson had built his reputation on running a tight ship, and Forward Operating Base Phoenix reflected his exacting standards. He prided himself on maintaining discipline and order in one of the most challenging theaters of operation. "You must be the consultant from Washington," Patterson said, extending his hand with a perfunctory smile. His tone carried the barely concealed irritation that many field commanders felt towards civilian oversight. "I'm Colonel Patterson. I run this base." Sarah shook his hand firmly, noting the calluses that spoke of a man who still handled weapons regularly despite his rank. "Sarah Martinez, thank you for accommodating this visit, Colonel. Let's get one thing straight from the start," Patterson said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "This is a combat zone, not some corporate boardroom. We don't have time for fancy consultants coming in here telling us how to do our jobs. My soldiers and I have been keeping this sector secure for 8 months, and we don't need some pencil pusher from the Pentagon questioning our methods." The soldiers within earshot shifted uncomfortably at their commander's blunt words, but none dared to intervene. Sarah simply nodded, her expression remaining neutral. She had encountered this attitude many times throughout her career, particularly early on when she had to prove herself in a male-dominated military culture. "I understand your concerns, Colonel," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm here to observe and learn, not to interfere with your operations." Patterson's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Observe and learn? Lady, you probably couldn't last 5 minutes out there beyond the wire. This isn't some academic exercise. We're dealing with Taliban fighters who would love nothing more than to overrun this base and kill every American here. So forgive me if I don't take advice from someone who's probably never been closer to combat than a war movie." The comment stung, though Sarah showed no reaction. Throughout her career, she had faced similar dismissals from men who assumed her gender made her unqualified for military service. What made this particular slight more painful was that Patterson had no idea he was speaking to someone who had spent more time in combat zones than he had years in service. "I'll try to stay out of your way," Sarah said simply, though inwardly she was already forming assessments about Patterson's leadership style and its potential impact on mission effectiveness. As they walked through the base, Patterson continued his monologue about the challenges of command in Afghanistan, clearly enjoying what he perceived as an opportunity to educate a naive civilian. He pointed out defensive positions, explained patrol routes, and detailed the complex tribal politics that affected their operations. Despite his condescending tone, Sarah had to admit that Patterson knew his business. The base was well organized, and his tactical understanding of the local situation seemed sound. "See that hill over there?" Patterson gestured toward a rocky outcropping about 2 kilometers distant. "Taliban spotters use it to watch our movements. We've cleared it 3 times, but they keep coming back. It's like playing whack-a-mole, except the moles have AK-47s and improvised explosive devices." Sarah studied the terrain with the practiced eye of someone who had planned countless military operations. The hill commanded an excellent view of the base's main entrance and helicopter landing zone. In her mind, she was already considering alternative approaches to neutralize the threat, but she kept her tactical insights to herself. "How do you typically handle the spotter problem?" she asked, genuinely curious about Patterson's methods. "We send out a squad every few days to sweep the area," Patterson replied. It's dangerous work, but it keeps them guessing. Last week, we caught 2 of them with a radio and some kind of optical equipment. My boys handled it appropriately. The phrase handled it appropriately was military speak that could cover a multitude of actions, and Sarah chose not to press for details. She was here to observe, not to conduct an investigation, though she made mental notes about everything she witnessed. As evening approached, Patterson invited Sarah to observe the daily briefing where squad leaders reported on patrol activities and intelligence gathered from local sources. The meeting was conducted with military efficiency, and Sarah was impressed by the professionalism of the junior officers despite their obvious youth. "Ma'am, we've got reports of increased Taliban movement in Sector 7, reported Lieutenant Thompson, a earnest young man who couldn't have been more than 25. Local sources suggest they might be planning something for the next new moon." "What kind of something?" Patterson asked, his tone sharper than before. "Unknown, sir. Could be anything from a probe of our perimeter to a full-scale assault." The informant wasn't specific, and, frankly, his reliability is questionable. Sarah listened to the exchange with interest. Intelligence gathering in counterinsurgency operations was always a challenge, requiring commanders to make decisions based on incomplete and often contradictory information. She had faced similar situations countless times during her own deployments. After the briefing, Patterson walked Sarah to her temporary quarters, a small trailer that had been hastily prepared for her visit. "Look," he said, his tone slightly less hostile than before. "I know I came on strong earlier, but you have to understand the pressure we're under here. Washington keeps sending people to second-guess our decisions, and, frankly, most of them don't have a clue about what we're dealing with." "I appreciate the honesty, Colonel," Sarah replied. "And I understand your frustration. Field commanders have always had to deal with oversight from people who weren't there when the bullets were flying." Patterson seemed surprised by her understanding response. "You sound like you might have some military experience yourself." Sarah smiled enigmatically. "I've been around the military for most of my adult life. You learn things." What she didn't tell Patterson was that her experience included command of multiple combat brigades, 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan, and decorations for valor that few officers would ever see. She had intentionally downplayed her background for this visit, wanting to observe how the base operated without the distorting effect that her true rank would create. As night fell over Forward Operating Base Phoenix, Sarah lay in her narrow bunk listening to the sounds of a military base settling into its nighttime routine. Guards called out passwords, helicopters arrived, and departed on missions she wasn't privy to, and, in the distance, she could hear the occasional crack of small arms fire that might or might not represent hostile contact. Tomorrow would bring new observations and insights into how Colonel Patterson ran his command. She was already forming opinions about his leadership style, both its strengths and weaknesses, but she would reserve judgment until she had seen more of his operation in action. What Patterson didn't know was that his visitor possessed decades of command experience that made her uniquely qualified to assess his performance. More importantly, she held a rank that would shock him if he ever learned the truth. For now, though, she was content to remain in the shadows, watching and learning while the colonel remained blissfully unaware that he had been lecturing one of the most senior officers in the United States military. The irony wasn't lost on her that throughout their conversation, Patterson had made assumptions based solely on her appearance and civilian attire. It was a reminder of how often competence and authority were misjudged based on superficial characteristics. In the morning, she would continue her assessment, gathering the information that would ultimately influence decisions made at the highest levels of military command. As she drifted off to sleep to the distant sounds of helicopters and generators, Sarah reflected on the day's events. Patterson was a capable officer, but his casual dismissal of outside input suggested potential blind spots that could prove problematic. She would spend the next few days testing that hypothesis while maintaining her low profile. The colonel's laughter still echoed in her memory, along with his confident assertions about her inability to understand military operations. If only he knew that the woman he had dismissed so casually held a rank that placed her among the most senior officers in the entire United States Armed Forces. But that revelation would come later, and when it did, it would fundamentally change Patterson's perspective on everything that had transpired during their first encounter. For now, Sarah Martinez was content to let the colonel continue believing he was dealing with just another civilian consultant from Washington. The truth would emerge in due time, and when it did, it would serve as a powerful lesson about the dangers of making assumptions based on appearances alone. The morning sun cast long shadows across Forward Operating Base Phoenix as Sarah made her way to the mess hall for breakfast. The base was already alive with activity, soldiers moving purposefully between buildings while vehicles rumbled past carrying supplies and personnel. She had slept better than expected despite the unfamiliar surroundings and the distant sound of artillery fire that had punctuated the night. Colonel Patterson was already seated at a corner table when she entered the dining facility, surrounded by his senior staff. Their conversation halted abruptly when they noticed her approach, and she could sense the mixture of curiosity and skepticism in their glances. Word had clearly spread about the civilian consultant who had arrived the previous day. "Good morning, Ms. Martinez," Patterson said with forced politeness, gesturing to an empty chair. "I trust you slept well despite our little fireworks display last night. Just some harassment fire from our Taliban friends. Nothing we can't handle." Sarah took the offered seat and accepted a cup of coffee from a passing soldier. "I've heard worse," she replied calmly, though she noticed the surprised looks from the other officers. Her matter-of-fact response to what they assumed would be her first exposure to combat conditions clearly wasn't what they expected from a civilian consultant. Major Williams, Patterson's executive officer, leaned forward with interest. "You've been in combat zones before, ma'am?" "A few times," Sarah answered vaguely, stirring her coffee. "Different theaters, different circumstances." Patterson's laugh had an edge to it. "I'm sure riding along with some general staff on a fact-finding mission gave you quite the adrenaline rush. But that's not exactly the same as living with the constant threat of attack, wondering if today's patrol will be the one that doesn't come back." The comment revealed more about Patterson's mindset than he probably intended. Sarah recognized the defensive attitude of a field commander who felt his sacrifices weren't appreciated by the higher echelons of military bureaucracy. It was a common sentiment, and not entirely without merit. But it also suggested a narrow perspective that could limit operational effectiveness. "You're absolutely right, Colonel," Sarah agreed. "Nothing compares to the responsibility of command in a combat environment." Her diplomatic response seemed to mollify Patterson somewhat, though she could see he was still trying to categorize her. The other officers at the table were equally puzzled by her composure and apparent familiarity with military terminology. After breakfast, Patterson announced his intention to give Sarah a comprehensive tour of the base's defensive positions. "Since you're here to observe and learn," he said with barely concealed sarcasm, "you might as well see how real soldiers prepare for combat." They began at the main gate, where heavily armed guards checked identification and searched incoming vehicles for explosives. Patterson explained the security protocols with obvious pride, detailing the multiple layers of defense designed to prevent infiltration by Taliban fighters or suicide bombers. "Every person who enters this base is a potential threat," Patterson lectured as they watched guards inspect a supply convoy. "We've had instances where supposed allies turned their weapons on our soldiers. Trust is a luxury we can't afford in this environment." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, though she was already noting several potential improvements to the security procedures. The inspection process was thorough but inefficient, creating bottlenecks that could be exploited by attackers. However, she kept her observations to herself, maintaining her role as an interested observer rather than a critical evaluator. As they moved through the base, Patterson continued his running commentary on the challenges of counterinsurgency warfare. He spoke knowledgeably about the difficulties of distinguishing between civilian contractors and potential threats, the complexities of working with Afghan National Army units of questionable reliability, and the frustration of fighting an enemy that could blend seamlessly into the local population. "The Taliban don't wear uniforms," Patterson explained as they examined a checkpoint. "That farmer bringing vegetables to our gate could be gathering intelligence for an attack next week. That teenager asking for work might be planning to plant an IED inside our perimeter. We have to be suspicious of everyone while still trying to win hearts and minds. It's an impossible balance." Despite his condescending attitude toward her, Sarah found herself respecting Patterson's tactical acumen. His analysis of the operational environment was sophisticated, and his security measures, while imperfect, showed careful thought and adaptation to local conditions. The colonel might be arrogant, but he wasn't incompetent. Their tour was interrupted by the sound of gunfire from the perimeter. Patterson's radio crackled to life immediately, and Sarah could hear the tense voices of soldiers reporting contact with enemy forces near the eastern gate. The colonel's demeanor shifted instantly from tour guide to combat commander. "Hawk 6, this is Phoenix Base," Patterson spoke into his radio with calm authority. "Report your status." Phoenix Base, we've got approximately 6 to 8 Taliban fighters with small arms engaging our outer checkpoint, came the reply. No casualties yet, but they've got us pinned down behind the barriers. Patterson was already moving toward the command center, his earlier concern about his civilian visitor apparently forgotten in the face of immediate tactical requirements. Sarah followed without being asked, her own instincts engaging as she mentally assessed the developing situation. In the command center, Patterson quickly established control over the response to the attack. He coordinated with the engaged unit while simultaneously deploying a flanking force to envelop the Taliban fighters. His commands were clear and decisive, and Sarah could see why his subordinates respected his leadership despite his abrasive personality. "Sir, we need permission to pursue the hostiles if they break contact," requested the platoon leader on the radio. Patterson hesitated for a moment, weighing the risks of allowing his soldiers to leave the relative safety of the base perimeter. Sarah recognized the classic dilemma faced by commanders in Afghanistan, the tension between aggressive pursuit of the enemy and force protection for their own troops. "Negative, Hawk 6, Patterson finally replied. "Maintain defensive positions. Do not pursue beyond checkpoint Charlie." It was a prudent decision, though Sarah suspected it frustrated the soldiers who wanted to take the fight to their attackers. She had made similar calls during her own combat commands, understanding that tactical caution often trumped aggressive action in counterinsurgency environments. The firefight lasted approximately 30 minutes before the Taliban fighters melted away into the surrounding terrain, leaving behind only empty brass casings and the acrid smell of gunpowder. No coalition forces were injured, though several vehicles had taken minor damage from small arms fire. After confirming that all his soldiers were accounted for, Patterson turned to Sarah with a mixture of embarrassment and defiance. "Welcome to Afghanistan, Ms. Martinez. This is what we deal with every day while consultants in Washington debate strategy over coffee and donuts." "Your response was well coordinated," Sarah observed, choosing to focus on his tactical performance rather than his continued verbal jabs. "Your soldiers showed good fire discipline and followed your orders precisely." Patterson seemed surprised by her professional assessment. "You sound like you know something about small unit tactics." "I've studied military operations extensively," Sarah replied carefully. "It's part of understanding how policy translates into practice in the field." What she didn't mention was that she had commanded similar actions dozens of times, often under far more challenging circumstances. She had developed many of the tactical procedures that units like Patterson's now used as standard operating protocol. As the base returned to normal operations, Patterson's attitude toward Sarah seemed to soften slightly. Her calm reaction to the morning's excitement and her knowledgeable comments about military tactics had apparently impressed him more than he was willing to admit. "I suppose you'll be writing a report about what happened today," Patterson said as they walked back toward the main compound. "Some analysis about how we could have handled things differently." "I'm here to learn, not to criticize," Sarah replied diplomatically. "You and your soldiers performed professionally under fire. That speaks well of your training and leadership." The compliment was genuine, though Patterson received it with obvious skepticism. He had clearly dealt with too many visiting officials who offered false praise while preparing critical reports behind closed doors. "Look, I know what this is really about," Patterson said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Some general in Washington thinks we're not aggressive enough out here. They want us to take more risks, push harder against the Taliban, show more measurable results. But they're not the ones who have to write letters to families when soldiers don't come home." His comment revealed the fundamental tension that Sarah knew existed between field commanders and senior leadership. The pressure to show progress in an unconventional war often conflicted with the natural caution of officers responsible for their soldiers' lives. "What would you do differently if you had more resources?" Sarah asked, genuinely interested in his perspective. Patterson considered the question carefully. "More intelligence assets, better cooperation from Pakistani border guards, and rules of engagement that let us actually fight the enemy instead of playing defense all the time. But, mostly, I'd want Washington to understand that counterinsurgency takes time. You can't defeat the Taliban with quarterly progress reports." It was a thoughtful answer that revealed the depth of Patterson's understanding of his operational environment. Despite his obvious frustration with higher authority, he grasped the complexities of the mission better than many officers at his level. As the day progressed, Sarah continued her observations while maintaining her low profile. She watched Patterson interact with his subordinates, noting both his strengths as a leader and the areas where his command style might be improved. His tactical competence was evident, but his dismissive attitude toward outside input suggested a potential weakness that could be exploited by an adaptable enemy. The colonel's laughter from their first meeting still echoed in Sarah's mind, along with his confident assertions about her inability to understand military operations. Each hour of observation provided more evidence of his capabilities while also revealing the blind spots that came with his particular brand of military arrogance. What Patterson still didn't realize was that his visitor possessed more combat experience than most generals, let alone colonels. She had commanded brigade-level operations in multiple theaters, developed counterinsurgency doctrine that was now taught at military academies, and earned decorations that few officers would ever see. But, for now, she remained content to let him continue believing he was educating a naive civilian about the realities of warfare. The truth would eventually emerge, and, when it did, it would fundamentally change Patterson's understanding of everything that had transpired during her visit. But that revelation lay in the future, and, until then, Sarah would continue gathering the information that would ultimately influence decisions made at the highest levels of military command. The third day of Sarah's visit began with an urgent situation that would test both her resolve to remain anonymous and Colonel Patterson's leadership under genuine pressure. She was reviewing notes from her observations when the base alarm system began wailing, followed immediately by the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. "Take cover. Incoming," shouted voices throughout the compound as soldiers dove behind protective barriers and into reinforced bunkers. Sarah found herself pressed against a concrete wall alongside several young soldiers who looked at her with expressions mixing concern for the civilian in their midst with the focused alertness of combat veterans. Patterson's voice boomed over the base's communication system, calm and authoritative despite the ongoing barrage. "All personnel, this is Phoenix Base. We are under mortar attack. Implement Defensive Protocol Charlie. I repeat, Defensive Protocol Charlie is now in effect." The attack was more sustained and better coordinated than the previous day's small arms engagement. Sarah counted at least 15 rounds impacting within the base perimeter, some uncomfortably close to critical facilities including the ammunition storage area and the helicopter landing zone. This wasn't harassment fire, it was a deliberate attempt to cause significant damage and casualties. From her position behind the protective barrier, Sarah could see Patterson moving between defensive positions, personally checking on his soldiers while coordinating the base's response. Despite her earlier reservations about his leadership style, she had to admire his physical courage and hands-on approach to command during the crisis. "Counter-battery radar has a fix on their position," reported Major Williams over the radio. Grid reference 41 SMD12345-67890. Approximately 2 kilometers north-northwest of our position. Patterson immediately began coordinating with nearby artillery units to return fire on the Taliban mortar position. His responses were crisp and professional, and Sarah could see why his superiors had confidence in his tactical abilities despite any personality shortcomings. "Fire mission, over," Patterson spoke into his radio to the supporting artillery unit. Grid 41 SMD12345-67890. Taliban mortar position. High explosive. Fire for effect. The incoming rounds stopped as suddenly as they had begun, suggesting that the Taliban fighters were already displacing their weapons to avoid counter-battery fire. It was a common tactic that Sarah had encountered countless times during her own deployments. Hit hard and fast, then melt away before effective retaliation could be organized. As the all-clear signal sounded across the base, Patterson emerged from the command bunker with dirt on his uniform and a grim expression on his face. 3 soldiers had been wounded by shrapnel, though none seriously, and 1 helicopter had taken damage that would ground it for several days pending repairs. "Ms. Martinez," Patterson called out as he spotted her among the soldiers emerging from cover. "Are you injured?" "I'm fine, Colonel," Sarah replied, brushing dust from her clothes. "How are your casualties?" "Minor wounds, thank God," Patterson answered. But this attack was different from their usual harassment. They used at least 3 mortar tubes in a coordinated fire mission. That suggests better planning and more sophisticated leadership than we've seen before. Sarah nodded, though she was already analyzing the attack pattern and forming her own conclusions about the Taliban's tactical evolution. The timing, target selection, and rapid displacement all indicated a level of military sophistication that suggested foreign training or advice. They hit right during the morning supply convoy arrival, she observed. That's not coincidental. Patterson looked at her sharply. What do you mean? They were watching your patterns, Sarah explained. The convoy arrives at the same time every Tuesday and Thursday. The helicopter landing zone is always busy during those periods. They timed their attack to maximize potential damage to both personnel and equipment. The colonel's expression shifted from surprise to something approaching respect. That's a very astute tactical observation for a civilian consultant. Sarah realized she had revealed more of her military thinking than intended, but the heat of the moment had overridden her caution. Sometimes patterns become obvious when you're looking from the outside. What she didn't tell Patterson was that she had developed much of the doctrine for analyzing enemy attack patterns during her previous commands. The tactical indicators she had just described were part of standard counterinsurgency analysis that she had helped create. As the base settled into post-attack procedures, Patterson insisted that Sarah accompany him on his damage assessment tour. Since you're here to observe our operations, he said, though his tone had lost much of its earlier condescension, you might as well see how we handle the aftermath of an attack. They visited the wounded soldiers first, where Sarah was struck by Patterson's genuine concern for his troops. He knew each injured man by name, understood their personal backgrounds, and took time to reassure them despite the pressing demands of post-attack analysis. Whatever his flaws, the colonel clearly cared about the soldiers under his command. At the helicopter landing zone, they examined the damaged aircraft with the maintenance chief. How long until she's flight ready? Patterson asked, gesturing toward the helicopter that had taken shrapnel damage to its main rotor system. At least 4 days, sir, replied the chief warrant officer. We'll need to replace several components, and some of the electronics will require complete rewiring. She's grounded until further notice. Patterson's jaw tightened with frustration. The damaged helicopter represented a significant reduction in his unit's mobility and casualty evacuation capability. In an environment where medical evacuation often meant the difference between life and death, the loss of even one aircraft was a serious blow. This is exactly what I was talking about yesterday, Patterson said to Sarah as they walked away from the damaged helicopter. We're fighting an enemy that can attack us whenever they choose, then disappear into the population. Meanwhile, we're stuck defending fixed positions with insufficient resources and too many restrictions on how we can respond. Sarah understood his frustration, though she also recognized the broader strategic considerations that shaped the rules of engagement Patterson found so limiting. What would you do differently if you had complete tactical freedom? Patterson considered the question while they continued their tour of the damaged facilities. Aggressive patrols into Taliban territory, preemptive strikes against known enemy positions, and, most importantly, the authority to pursue fleeing attackers regardless of political boundaries. His answer revealed both tactical sophistication and political naivety. Sarah knew that many of the restrictions Patterson chafed against existed for good strategic reasons, but she also understood how those limitations could frustrate field commanders facing daily attacks. The Taliban mortar position that hit us this morning, Patterson continued. They're probably back across the Pakistani border by now. We know where they came from, we know where they're going, but we can't touch them once they cross that imaginary line on the map. It was a classic example of the challenges inherent in fighting an insurgency that enjoyed sanctuary across international borders. Sarah had dealt with similar frustrations during her own combat commands, though her higher rank had given her access to strategic considerations that Patterson wasn't privy to. As they completed their damage assessment, a messenger arrived with news that would further test Patterson's leadership. Intelligence sources reported a significant Taliban buildup in the surrounding area, with indications that the morning's attack might be a precursor to a larger assault on the base. Sir, we've got multiple reports of Taliban fighters massing in grid squares 345 through 350, reported the intelligence officer. Local sources suggest they might be planning a coordinated attack within the next 48 hours. Patterson absorbed this information while Sarah watched his decision-making process. She could see him weighing options, request additional support from higher headquarters, increase the base's defensive posture, or launch preemptive operations to disrupt the suspected Taliban preparations. Double the guard at all checkpoints, Patterson ordered. Cancel all non-essential patrols, and bring in our forward observation posts. I want every soldier inside the wire until we know more about what we're facing. It was a prudent decision that prioritized force protection, though Sarah knew it would also cede the initiative to the Taliban forces gathering outside the base perimeter. The colonel was clearly thinking defensively rather than aggressively, a mindset that reflected both his concern for his soldiers and his limited tactical options. "What about air support?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about his planning process. "Already requested," Patterson replied. "But we're competing with other units that are facing similar threats. There's only so much close air support available, and everyone thinks their situation is the most critical." His response revealed another layer of the challenges facing mid-level commanders in Afghanistan. Patterson was fighting not just the Taliban, but also a complex bureaucracy that forced him to compete with other units for scarce resources. As evening approached, Sarah found herself reflecting on the day's events. The mortar attack had provided valuable insights into both Patterson's leadership capabilities and the broader tactical situation facing his unit. Despite his abrasive personality, the colonel had performed well under fire, making sound decisions while maintaining his composure in a dangerous situation. What continued to amaze her was Patterson's complete ignorance of her true background and qualifications. Throughout their conversations about tactics and strategy, he continued to treat her as an outsider who needed basic military concepts explained to her. The irony would have been amusing if the situation weren't so serious. That evening's briefing focused entirely on preparations for the suspected Taliban attack. Patterson's staff worked efficiently to coordinate defensive measures while maintaining normal base operations. Sarah observed the planning process with professional interest, noting both the strengths and potential improvements in their procedures. "Intelligence suggests the attack will come at dawn," Major Williams reported to the assembled staff. "Traditional Taliban tactic is to hit us when they think we're least alert. Then, we'll be ready for them," Patterson replied grimly. "Double shifts on all defensive positions. I want every weapon system checked and ready. And get me an updated count on our ammunition reserves." As the briefing concluded, Patterson approached Sarah with an unexpected request. "Ms. Martinez, I want you in the bunker tomorrow morning. I know you're here to observe, but I won't have a civilian casualty on my watch." Sarah nodded her agreement, though inwardly she was already analyzing the defensive preparations from a commander's perspective. She had noticed several potential vulnerabilities in the base's defensive plan, but mentioning them would reveal more about her military expertise than she was prepared to disclose. The colonel's protective attitude toward her was both touching and ironic. If he only knew that the woman he was trying to shield from danger had commanded combat operations involving thousands of soldiers under far more challenging circumstances. As she prepared for what might be a violent night, Sarah reflected on the complexity of Patterson's situation. He was a competent officer facing an impossible mission with insufficient resources and too many constraints. His frustration with higher authority was understandable, even if his assumptions about her background were completely wrong. Tomorrow would bring new challenges that would test everything Patterson had learned about command and combat. And, throughout it all, Sarah would continue observing, gathering the information that would ultimately influence decisions made at levels far above forward operating base Phoenix. Dawn came with the distinctive thump of helicopter rotors and the distant crack of small arms fire. Sarah had spent most of the night in the command bunker alongside Colonel Patterson and his staff, watching them coordinate preparations for the anticipated Taliban assault. The attack, when it finally came, exceeded even the most pessimistic intelligence estimates. "Contact. Multiple Taliban fighters approaching from 3 directions," came the urgent radio report from the perimeter guards. "This is not a probe. This is a full-scale assault." Patterson's response was immediate and professional. "All units, this is Phoenix Base. We are under coordinated attack. Implement Defensive Plan Alpha. All personnel to assigned positions immediately." Through the bunker's reinforced windows, Sarah could see muzzle flashes dancing in the pre-dawn darkness as Taliban fighters advanced under cover of mortar fire. The attack was far more sophisticated than previous engagements, involving at least 50 fighters using coordinated fire and movement tactics that suggested extensive planning and possibly foreign training. "Sir, they're using the Wadi approach we identified as a potential vulnerability," reported Major Williams, studying the tactical display. 2 squads are advancing undercover while a third provides suppressive fire from the ridgeline. Sarah noted the tactical sophistication of the attack with professional interest. The Taliban were demonstrating a level of coordination and tactical awareness that far exceeded their usual capabilities. Someone with significant military training was clearly directing their operations. Patterson moved between radio stations in the bunker, simultaneously coordinating defensive fires, requesting air support, and maintaining contact with his scattered defensive positions. Despite the intensity of the situation, his commands remained clear and decisive. Hawk 2, this is Phoenix Base, Patterson spoke into his headset. Taliban fighters are advancing on your position from the northeast. Do you have them in sight? Affirmative, Phoenix Base. We count at least 12 fighters with automatic weapons. They're using covering fire and advancing by bounds. These guys know what they're doing. Sarah could hear the tension in the young soldier's voice, but also noted the professional manner in which he was reporting contact. Patterson's training standards were clearly paying dividends under fire. Cleared to engage when you have clear targets, Patterson authorized. Watch your fields of fire and maintain communication. The battle intensified as Taliban fighters pressed their attack against multiple sections of the base perimeter simultaneously. Patterson had positioned his forces well, but the sheer number of attackers was beginning to strain his defensive capabilities. Phoenix Base, this is Overwatch, came a new voice on the radio. We have eyes on your situation from Grid 356789, requesting permission to engage Taliban fighters in the open. Sarah recognized the call sign as belonging to a sniper team positioned on high ground overlooking the base. Patterson immediately authorized their engagement, and within moments the distinctive crack of precision rifle fire began picking off Taliban fighters who exposed themselves during their advance. Good shooting, Overwatch, Patterson acknowledged. Continue engaging targets of opportunity. Despite the defensive preparations, the Taliban assault was beginning to penetrate the base's outer defenses. A section of the eastern perimeter came under intense pressure as fighters with rocket-propelled grenades began targeting defensive positions. Phoenix Base, Hawk 3 is taking heavy fire, reported a squad leader whose position was being overrun. We've got multiple casualties and are running low on ammunition. Request immediate support. Patterson faced the classic command dilemma, whether to commit his reserves to shore up a threatened position or maintain them for an even more critical situation that might develop. Sarah watched his decision-making process with professional interest, recognizing the pressures that came with tactical command under fire. Delta Squad, move to support Hawk 3 immediately, Patterson ordered. Bravo Squad, shift left to cover Delta's original sector. And give me that air support now. The commitment of his reserve force was a calculated risk that reflected Patterson's understanding of the tactical situation. Sarah noted that his decision was both timely and appropriate, though it left him with limited options if the Taliban managed to breach the perimeter elsewhere. 20 minutes into the battle, the situation took a dramatic turn when Taliban fighters succeeded in penetrating the base's eastern defensive line. Suddenly, the fight shifted from a defensive engagement to close-quarters combat within the base perimeter itself. We've got enemy fighters inside the wire, came an urgent radio call. They're advancing toward the helicopter landing zone and the ammunition storage area. Patterson's face went grim as he realized the implications. If the Taliban reached the ammunition depot, they could potentially destroy the entire base in a catastrophic explosion. The helicopter landing zone was equally critical, as it represented the base's primary means of evacuation and resupply. All available personnel, converge on the ammunition storage area, Patterson commanded. Priority is protecting that facility at all costs. Sarah watched the colonel coordinate the desperate defense of his base with growing admiration for his tactical acumen. Despite the overwhelming odds and the penetration of his defensive perimeter, Patterson maintained his composure and continued making sound decisions under extreme pressure. The battle for the ammunition depot became a vicious close-quarters engagement involving grenades, automatic weapons, and hand-to-hand combat. Sarah could hear the fighting through the bunker walls, a chaotic symphony of explosions, gunfire, and shouted commands that painted a vivid picture of desperate soldiers fighting for their lives. "Sir, we need to consider evacuation procedures," Major Williams suggested quietly. "If they breach the ammunition storage area," Patterson shook his head firmly. "We're not abandoning this base. Get me every available soldier in that fight. And where the hell is our air support?" "Falcon flight is 2 minutes out," reported the air support coordinator. Apache helicopters with full ordnance load. The arrival of close air support marked the beginning of the end for the Taliban assault. The Apache helicopters immediately began engaging enemy fighters with devastating precision, their cannon fire and Hellfire missiles turning the tide of battle in favor of the defenders. "Phoenix Base, Falcon 1, came the pilot's voice over the radio. "We have multiple Taliban fighters in the open. Engaging now." The distinctive sound of the Apache's 30mm chain gun filled the air as the helicopter pilots systematically eliminated Taliban fighters who had penetrated the base perimeter. Within minutes, the coordinated assault began to collapse as surviving attackers sought cover or attempted to withdraw. Falcon 1, Phoenix Base, Patterson responded gratefully. Cleared to engage all hostile forces within a 500-meter radius of the base perimeter. The helicopter assault effectively ended the Taliban attack, though sporadic small arms fire continued for another hour as the remaining fighters were systematically eliminated or driven off. When the shooting finally stopped, Forward Operating Base Phoenix had survived its most serious challenge since Patterson had assumed command. The aftermath of the battle revealed both the effectiveness of Patterson's defensive preparations and the high cost of victory. 7 American soldiers had been wounded, 2 seriously, and significant portions of the base's defensive infrastructure had been damaged or destroyed. Sarah emerged from the command bunker alongside Patterson to survey the damage. Bodies of Taliban fighters lay scattered around the base perimeter, evidence of the desperate fighting that had taken place. The ammunition storage area showed signs of the fierce battle that had been fought to protect it, but the facility itself remained intact. Casualty report. Patterson requested as his medical personnel worked to stabilize the wounded. 7 wounded, sir, reported the medic. 2 urgent, 5 routine. We've got them stabilized, but the urgent cases need immediate evacuation. Patterson immediately began coordinating medical evacuation procedures, his concern for his wounded soldiers taking precedence over all other considerations. Sarah watched him work with the same professional competence he had demonstrated throughout the battle. Medevac inbound. ETA 15 minutes, announced the communications operator. Landing zone is clear and secure. As the medical evacuation helicopter arrived to transport the seriously wounded soldiers, Patterson took time to visit each casualty personally. Despite the ongoing demands of post-battle operations, he made sure each wounded soldier knew their sacrifice was appreciated and that they would receive the best possible medical care. You did good work today, soldier, Patterson told a young private who had been wounded while defending the ammunition depot. Your actions helped save this entire base. The private managed a weak smile despite his pain. Thank you, sir. Just doing my job. After the casualties had been evacuated, Patterson turned his attention to assessing the broader implications of the battle. The Taliban assault had been far more sophisticated and coordinated than anything his unit had faced previously, suggesting a significant escalation in enemy capabilities. They knew exactly where to hit us, Patterson told Sarah as they examined the damaged eastern perimeter. The timing, the approach routes, the target selection, everything indicated detailed intelligence about our defensive preparations. Sarah nodded, though she was already analyzing the attack from a strategic perspective that exceeded Patterson's immediate tactical concerns. The level of coordination and tactical sophistication suggested that the Taliban were receiving significant outside support, possibly including detailed intelligence about coalition defensive positions. What's your assessment of their capabilities? She asked, genuinely interested in Patterson's analysis. They're getting better, Patterson replied grimly. Better training, better equipment, and definitely better intelligence. This wasn't the same ragtag group of farmers with AK-47s that we faced when we first got here. These fighters knew what they were doing. His assessment was both accurate and troubling. Sarah had observed similar tactical evolution during her previous deployments, understanding that adaptive enemies were always the most dangerous. The Taliban's ability to learn and improve their tactics posed ongoing challenges for coalition forces throughout Afghanistan. As evening fell over the battle-scarred base, Patterson gathered his staff for an after-action review. Despite his exhaustion, the colonel insisted on conducting a thorough analysis of the day's events while details remained fresh in everyone's memory. What did we do right? And what can we do better? Patterson asked his assembled officers. I want honest assessments, not cheerleading. The discussion that followed revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the base's defensive preparations. While the overall defensive plan had proven effective, several vulnerabilities had been exposed that would require immediate attention. Sarah listened to the analysis with professional interest, noting that Patterson's approach to learning from combat experience was both thorough and constructive. Despite his earlier dismissive attitude toward outside input, the colonel was clearly committed to continuous improvement based on battlefield feedback. The Eastern approach needs additional obstacles, Major Williams observed. They were able to advance closer than we anticipated before coming under effective fire. Agreed, Patterson responded. And we need better communication between our observation posts and the main defensive positions. There was a delay in reporting the initial penetration that could have been critical. As the after-action review concluded, Patterson approached Sarah with an observation that surprised her. "You handled yourself well during the attack, Ms. Martinez. Most civilians would have been terrified, but you seemed remarkably calm for someone experiencing combat for the first time." Sarah smiled enigmatically. Adrenaline affects people differently. Some panic, others get very focused. What she didn't tell Patterson was that today's battle, while intense, was far from the most challenging combat situation she had faced during her military career. She had commanded forces in firefights involving thousands of soldiers and had made life and death decisions under pressure that made today's engagement seem almost routine by comparison. The colonel's continued assumptions about her background and experience remained both amusing and frustrating. Throughout the day's fighting, he had treated her as a civilian observer who needed protection rather than recognizing that she possessed more combat experience than most of his staff officers combined. But the truth would emerge soon enough, and when it did, it would fundamentally change Patterson's understanding of everything that had transpired during her visit to Forward Operating Base Phoenix. The morning after the Taliban assault found Forward Operating Base Phoenix transformed from a battle-scarred outpost into a hub of intense activity. Helicopters arrived and departed regularly, bringing replacement equipment, additional personnel, and high-ranking officers who wanted first-hand assessments of the previous day's fighting. Colonel Patterson moved between meetings with visiting officials while simultaneously overseeing repairs to his damaged defenses. Sarah had spent the night reviewing her notes and preparing for what she knew would be a challenging conversation. Her visit was scheduled to end today, and the time had come to reveal information that would fundamentally alter Patterson's understanding of everything that had transpired during her stay. "Ms. Martinez," Patterson called out as she approached the command center. "I've got a few minutes before my next briefing with some Pentagon officials. I wanted to thank you for your conduct during yesterday's attack. You showed real courage under fire." "Thank you, Colonel," Sarah replied. "I've been meaning to discuss something important with you before I leave." Patterson gestured toward his office, a small trailer that served as his private workspace. "Of course. I assume you'll be writing some kind of report about your observations here." As they settled into chairs across from Patterson's desk, Sarah noticed the photographs covering one wall. Images of the colonel with various military units throughout his career, commendation certificates, and a picture of him shaking hands with a two-star general during a previous deployment. "Colonel Patterson," Sarah began carefully, "before I leave, there's something you should know about the purpose of my visit here." Patterson leaned back in his chair with a knowing smile. "Let me guess. You're not really a consultant from Washington. You're probably some kind of inspector general investigator looking into how we conduct operations here." "Not exactly," Sarah replied, reaching into her briefcase to retrieve a folder she had kept sealed throughout her visit. "I think you should read this before we continue our conversation." She handed Patterson an official document bearing the seal of the United States Army. As he opened it and began reading, his expression shifted from casual interest to confusion, then to complete shock as the reality of what he was seeing became clear. "This says you're," Patterson began, then stopped to read the document again more carefully. "General Sarah Martinez, United States Army. 3 stars. He looked up at her with an expression of disbelief mixed with growing horror. "You're a lieutenant general?" "That's correct," Sarah confirmed calmly. "I apologize for the deception, but I felt it was necessary to observe your operations without the artificial atmosphere that my rank would have created." Patterson stared at the document in his hands, as if it might transform into something else if he looked at it long enough. His face had gone pale, and Sarah could see him mentally reviewing every conversation they had shared, every dismissive comment he had made about civilian consultants and Pentagon bureaucrats. "You're Lieutenant General Martinez," he repeated slowly, as if saying the words might help him process their meaning. "The General Martinez who commanded the 82nd Airborne Division in Iraq, who wrote the counterinsurgency manual that we use for training, who received the Distinguished Service Cross for actions in Fallujah. Among other things, yes," Sarah acknowledged. "Though I prefer to think of myself simply as a soldier who's been privileged to serve in various capacities." The full magnitude of his situation was beginning to dawn on Patterson. Over the past 4 days, he had repeatedly dismissed, lectured, and condescended to one of the most senior and respected officers in the United States Army. He had laughed at her supposed ignorance of military operations while she quietly assessed his performance with decades of combat command experience. General Patterson began, then stopped as he struggled to find appropriate words. I don't know what to say. My conduct toward you has been completely inappropriate. I had no idea. You couldn't have known, Sarah replied diplomatically. That was the point of maintaining my civilian identity. I wanted to see how your unit operates under normal conditions, not how they perform when they know a 3-star general is watching. Patterson set the document down with hands that were visibly shaking. Everything I said about consultants from Washington, about people who don't understand combat operations. I was talking to someone who probably has more combat experience than anyone in my entire chain of command. You were expressing legitimate frustrations based on your experiences, Sarah said. Many of your concerns about the disconnect between policymakers and field commanders are well-founded. That's part of why visits like this are necessary. The colonel was clearly struggling to reconcile his image of the civilian consultant he had been dismissing for 4 days with the reality of the decorated general sitting across from him. When you asked me about tactics during the mortar attack, when you analyzed the Taliban's approach patterns, you weren't learning from me. You were evaluating my performance. I was doing both, Sarah clarified. You demonstrated solid tactical competence throughout my visit. Your response to yesterday's assault was particularly impressive. You maintained excellent command and control under pressure and made sound decisions that probably saved lives. Despite her reassurance, Patterson remained visibly shaken by the revelation. General, I need to ask, is this some kind of efficiency report? Are you here because someone has concerns about my command? Sarah had anticipated this question and had prepared her response carefully. I'm here because your unit has been selected for a potentially expanded role in this theater. My assessment will help determine whether additional resources and responsibilities should be allocated to Forward Operating Base Phoenix. The answer was truthful, though incomplete. Patterson's unit was indeed being considered for expanded operations, but Sarah's visit was also part of a broader evaluation of mid-level commanders throughout Afghanistan. His performance would influence not only his unit's future assignments, but also his own career prospects. The way I treated you, Patterson said, running his hands through his hair. Calling you a pencil pusher, laughing at your supposed ignorance of military operations. My career is finished, isn't it? Colonel Patterson, Sarah said firmly, your treatment of what you believe to be a civilian consultant was certainly unprofessional. However, your tactical competence and genuine care for your soldiers are evident. Leadership can be developed and refined. Combat effectiveness is harder to teach. Patterson absorbed her words while staring at the commendation certificates on his wall. I've always prided myself on being a professional officer. The way I acted toward you goes against everything I believe about military courtesy and respect for others. It does, Sarah agreed bluntly. Your assumptions about my background led you to dismiss input that might have been valuable, regardless of its source. In counterinsurgency operations, fresh perspectives can be critical to identifying vulnerabilities that routine operations might miss. The comment stung, but Patterson nodded his acceptance of the criticism. You mentioned several times that you'd seen combat before. I should have listened more carefully instead of assuming you were just another civilian who didn't understand military operations. The more important lesson, Sarah continued, is that effective commanders remain open to insights from unexpected sources. Some of the best tactical innovations I've seen came from junior enlisted soldiers or civilian contractors who approach problems without preconceived notions. As their conversation continued, Patterson gradually recovered from his initial shock and began engaging with Sarah as the senior officer she was. The change in his demeanor was dramatic. Gone was the condescending tone and defensive attitude, replaced by the professional respect appropriate when addressing a superior officer. General, may I ask for your assessment of our defensive preparations? Patterson requested. Given your experience, I'd value your professional opinion about areas where we might improve. Sarah appreciated his willingness to learn from his mistakes. Your basic defensive plan is sound, but you have some blind spots that yesterday's attack exposed. The Eastern approach needs additional obstacles, and your communication between observation posts could be more efficient. She spent the next hour providing detailed feedback about his unit's operations, drawing on her extensive experience to offer specific suggestions for improvement. Patterson listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and taking notes that demonstrated his commitment to implementing her recommendations. There's one more thing I need to address, Sarah said as their discussion neared its conclusion. Your frustrations with higher headquarters and the restrictions placed on your operations. Patterson shifted uncomfortably in his chair, remembering his various complaints about Pentagon bureaucrats and politicians who didn't understand the realities of combat. Your concerns about the disconnect between policy and practice are legitimate, Sarah continued. But the restrictions you find frustrating often exist for strategic reasons that aren't always apparent at the tactical level. Part of senior leadership's responsibility is balancing immediate tactical requirements against broader strategic objectives. I understand that now, General, Patterson replied. But it's difficult when you're watching your soldiers take casualties, and you feel like your hands are tied by rules that don't make sense from a tactical perspective. That tension has existed as long as there have been military organizations, Sarah acknowledged. The key is maintaining faith in the system while continuing to advocate for your soldiers' needs through proper channels. As Sarah prepared to leave Forward Operating Base Phoenix, she reflected on the complexity of Patterson's situation and character. He was clearly a competent tactical commander who cared deeply about his soldiers, but his dismissive attitude toward outside input represented a significant weakness that could limit his effectiveness as he advanced to higher levels of command. "Colonel," she said as they walked toward the helicopter that would take her back to Kabul, "you're a good officer with the potential to be an exceptional one. Don't let this experience discourage you. Learn from it." Patterson stood at attention as Sarah boarded the helicopter, his earlier casual demeanor replaced by the military courtesy appropriate when saying goodbye to his senior general officer. As the aircraft lifted off, he remained standing in the rotor wash, probably still processing the reality of what had transpired during her visit. From her seat in the helicopter, Sarah could see Forward Operating Base Phoenix shrinking below them, looking vulnerable and isolated in the harsh Afghan landscape. Patterson and his soldiers would continue their mission, facing daily challenges and dangers while trying to implement the lessons learned from her visit. The colonel's laughter from their first meeting seemed like it had happened weeks ago rather than just 4 days. His confident assertions about her inability to understand military operations now served as a reminder of how quickly assumptions could be proven wrong when reality intervened. Sarah opened her laptop and began drafting her assessment report, balancing Patterson's tactical competence against his interpersonal shortcomings. Her recommendation would influence not only his future assignments, but also the allocation of resources to his unit and the development of training programs for other mid-level commanders. Despite his initial rudeness and condescending attitude, she found herself hoping that Patterson would learn from this experience and develop into the kind of senior leader the Army needed. His genuine care for his soldiers and solid tactical instincts provided a good foundation for growth, assuming he could overcome his tendency to dismiss input from sources he didn't immediately respect. The helicopter carried her away from Forward Operating Base Phoenix toward her next assignment, but the lessons from this visit would influence her thinking about leadership development for years to come. Sometimes the most valuable insights came from observing how capable officers reacted when they thought no one important was watching. Colonel Patterson would never forget the civilian consultant who turned out to be one of the Army's most senior generals, and, hopefully, he would never again make assumptions about people based solely on their appearance or apparent background. The truth, as he had learned in the most dramatic way possible, was often far more complex than initial impressions suggested.